So this is a Russian-made, Soviet-made BMP-1. And this vehicle, this weapon system, is why America eventually developed the Bradley APC. And I can attest personally to the effectiveness and the outstanding performance of the Bradley, because I myself owe my life to a Bradley. Back in the Iraq War, I was embedded with American troops, and we were ambushed in Sadr city in Baghdad, and the vehicle I was in got hit by 7 RPGs. And I am yet still here today, able to talk to you a little bit about a topic that is really prevalent these days, and that is whether or not the West, NATO, should be sending offensive-capable armored vehicles, most notably main battle tanks, say the Leopard, to Ukraine. So let's take a quick moment here and discuss this issue of armor. Now, I am filming this about 5 days after the Conference of Defense Ministers in Ramstein, Germany, in which the debate over what to send to Ukraine didn't really result in what many had hoped. And they were hoping for tanks. They were hoping for main battle tanks, in particular the German Leopard, because there are so many of them being used by a variety of European nations that they could supply a good chunk of them to Ukraine and make a significant difference on the battlefield. Ukraine is asking for about 300 or 400 of them to win this war. Now, no matter what the narrative is, I, in my humble opinion, believe this is not a war of attrition. Many people say it is right now because the lines are relatively static during the winter. No, I don't believe that this is a war of attrition any more than any war is a war of attrition. I believe this is a war of maneuver that is temporarily static and stalled because of the winter, because both sides need to kind of reassess and refit. And thirdly, you know, there's rearming or being supplied by the West with arms in the case of Ukraine. But when the situation changes, I have no doubt whatsoever that the war is going to become one of regaining territory, controlling territory, and by essence that means maneuver, and that means giving the Ukrainians the capacity to go on the offensive. Now, I'm filming this at a park that kind of overlooks Kiev in general, and it is the park where they kind of commemorate the victory in the Second World War, and that is the statue to the motherland. And I bring this up because there is a long-standing history that I fear is being played out yet again here in Ukraine, where European powers historically are playing the same role that they have done in many years, decades, centuries in the past. And I say that because the Germans are the ones who have been the most reluctant to send armor to Ukraine. Now, you could say it's because they don't want a repeat or the stigma or the replay of the history, the awful history of what happened here in the Second World War, where, you know, much of the fighting and much of the real intense fighting was on this territory, this part of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. And the Germans don't want to be seen as aggressors sending armor into Ukraine, and also maybe because they're closer to Russia. They know that when this war ends, as all wars do eventually end, there will have to be some sort of relationship with Russia. But then, of course, you also see other elements of European self-interest being played out in this question of what to send in terms of armor. The Poles, knowing the threat from Russia, have their interests at heart. The French, of course, realizing perhaps that this might signal a shift in the power structure in Europe from west to east, if indeed Ukraine does become sovereign. I have nothing to support that except for my own sneaking cynicism. I hope I'm wrong about that. Equally, I hope I'm wrong about that when it comes to Germany. The Brits, for example, who love to be spoilers on the continent in many ways, sending their Challenger 2s to kind of prod and push Germany to send their Leopards. Well, that might be part of that whole scheme as well. And then the Yanks with their interests in maybe destabilizing Russia. I mean, all of this is a little bit of cynicism, and I hope I'm wrong about it. I hope that people really still are genuinely about helping build and keep a sovereign Ukraine. But of course, every country has their interests. So, what Russia has said is that this is kind of a red line for them, because they know that if the West sends these main battle tanks, it could be a real game changer. Heretofore, the West has primarily supplied Ukraine with defensive weaponry, with the notable exception of some of the artillery that's been sent in and the sheer level of munitions. But if you start sending main battle tanks, you are in essence providing Ukrainians with the capability to go on the offensive. Russia would like this to be a prolonged conflict because they believe that these little European interests and transatlantic interests eventually will come apart if the war is a long one. So they want to see this war extended. The Ukrainians think that their idea is, let's get this war finished with a decisive victory on the battlefield, reestablish the battle lines and the borders of 2014, and in that way we draw this war to a close quicker. And while it might be more violent and the imagery is going to be awful, and the sheer level of destruction and death in the short term will be awful, it is preferable to the Ukrainians to do it that way than to draw it out over years and years, and maybe those fractures between various Western powers could come into effect as Vladimir Putin hopes, and they will lose that international support that they've relied upon. So there's also been this conversation about why don't the Americans send the Abrams? The Germans have made that point. They say they want the Abrams here first so that they don't look like the aggressor. Well, if that's what the Germans are going to need, again, my humble opinion, send an Abrams, send a company of Abrams just to make that symbolic move. That's all well and good. But there's another reason why the Abrams is another kettle of fish altogether. The Abrams is built around a jet engine, basically. It runs on jet fuel. And not only that, the jet turbine engine is a completely different beast than the diesel engine that you will find in most NATO main battle tanks, the Challenger 2, the Leopard 2, the Leclerc. So it's just a lot of infrastructure that would delay getting those Abrams up and running and keeping them running during what everybody suspects will be a spring offensive. They're still going to need training in any NATO main battle tank, but the Abrams is a really complicated system. Do it if the Germans insist, but I think realistically a European main battle tank is really what Ukraine needs. So now, also of note is, why don't we send the Abrams? Why don't the Americans send the Abrams? Well, the Abrams is a different beast altogether. It is built around a jet turbine engine, runs on jet fuel. It is not diesel like the Challenger 2, the Leopard 2, or the Leclerc. So would you take your car to a jet engine expert Or vice versa, would you take your jet fighter to the Jiffy Lube? Here's a number of other reasons why I think NATO should be sending armored weapon systems to Ukraine. And I want to make 2 points here, just briefly. One is that the Bradley, for example, is just a darn better troop vehicle, because not least of which is, this is how you get out of a BMP, these hatches, okay? Basically enough for a single man to jump out of. But a Bradley has this entire rear section, the hydraulic platform that drops down, and everybody can get out quick. And that brings me to my second point, why I think we should be sending NATO armor systems to Ukraine, and that is this. It will allow the Ukrainians to fight with modern NATO techniques, which is basically referred to as combined arms doctrine, which means you don't just attack with a single system, not just armor, not just close air support, not just fighting vehicles, not infantry, not artillery, not all separate, but all combined at once. It's a completely different military doctrine than the Russians use. They may say they use different, a similar doctrine, but they don't really. They use artillery, and they use masses of numbers of infantry, mostly conscripts. Ukraine does not want to fight that way, not least of which because they don't want to lose as many, or they don't have the capacity to lose as many soldiers as the Russians do, but also because combined arms doctrine is a better way of fighting a war. If we give the Ukrainians the capacity to fight in that way, they will certainly win. We've seen it in a number of scenarios in the past, but indisputably, in my opinion, if we give them the capacity to use armor and infantry and air and artillery all at once, they will fight in a better manner. The doctrine is simply better and more effective than what Russia does. And it will allow them to draw this conflict to a close quicker. So I've made this call before, but I'll make it again. Let's give them what they need to finish this war. And what they need is good kit, including main battle tanks. So, Slava Ukraini, Geroyam Slava. Oh, and there's another thing I want to add here. I thought I was done shooting, but it occurs to me there's another point worth making here. Again, with the difference between the BMP and the Bradley, and being able to get out of the vehicle, dismount, and start fighting. That's another aspect of this whole difference between Russian military doctrine and the combined arm doctrine of the NATO forces. And it's not just being, caring about the lives of your soldiers. I mean, if you're strictly looking at victory terms and winning on the battlefield, a soldier is going to fight a lot better if he's inside one of these and can dismount and fight, and he knows there's a tank that's rolling alongside him as well. It's better military doctrine. It's just a better way to fight. And it also, if you are being sensitive to, oh my gosh, keeping your soldiers alive, it means that your soldiers, if you don't have, like the Kremlin tends to think, an endless supply of soldiers that you can conscript and just throw out a front line. No, if you're Ukrainian and you want to keep your veteran soldiers who know how to fight alive, you want one of these things, a proper fighting vehicle like a Bradley or a Stryker, in combined arms with a main battle tank, to really win on the battlefield and have your soldiers able to come back yet again, even if there has to be a retreat. At the end of the day, keeping veteran soldiers alive, letting them fight in the best way that they possibly can, that's another way to beat a Russian military doctrine, which is basically just hit anything with a sledgehammer, because, well, if every obstacle is a nail, you want there to be a hammer. Oh, and finally, all of this, if you look at a lot of military footage, why do you think it is that Russian soldiers ride on top of these things and not inside them as they were originally designed? Because they're bloody death traps.